What's up guys, Vylocity from Pitchfork Academy, back with another Unreal Engine 5 tutorial, and in today's video I'll be teaching you how to set up Niagara Particle Systems to spawn on your skeletal mesh characters that actually use the bones as the spawn point, which is pretty great because that means as your character's moving around and the arms are swinging during your run animation, the particles will actually update and spawn based on that current bones location. I'll also be showing you how to create a particle master material, which allows you to swap things out like the texture or the fall off of the particle to instantly get a different particle look, as well as a way to soften the intersection of your particles with the ground and other meshes, so there's not a harsh seam or line where the particle meets other objects. But just before we jump in, I've got an exciting announcement to share. I've officially launched my Patreon. That's where you can get access to Vylocity's Vault, which will hold all the project files from Vylocity's past and future Unreal Engine 5 tutorials. They're not all up just yet, but I'll be adding them steadily as I go. This is the best way to support me so I can continue to bring you high quality Unreal Engine tutorials. Right now it's half off until November, so it's the perfect time to jump on board. You'll find the Patreon link down in the description. And don't forget, you can also join our free Discord, the Pitchfork Academy, if you want to connect with other creators or maybe even get some help with one of your projects. Alrighty guys, here we are in a default version of Unreal Engine 5.6 using the third person template. And the first thing that we need to do is just to create a folder for Niagara. So I'll right click in our content browser, click new folder, and I'll call this Niagara. Once we have that, we'll double click to open it up. And then I'll go ahead and create a material. I want to create the material first because this will power all of our particle systems. Without this, our particle systems will look very bland and just like basically circles. So we need a material to apply a texture to. So I'll click material here and then I'll call it M underscore particle. I'll double click to open this up. And the first thing that we need to do is change some settings on the details panel, such as the blend mode. We want this to be additive. Now there is a reason to also use translucent. However, you can override this on the material instance later, and additive is the cheaper version to start. And then on, for example, the fire particle system, we'll actually use the translucent blend mode because we'll need the black color. And basically with additive, you can't get a color that's darker than what's behind it. So with most things, additive will work fine, but then there is the off chance you might need to use translucent. Shading model will be unlit instead of default lit. And now you'll see we only have the emissive color, opacity, and world position. The last thing we need to do on the details panel is find the usage section. And we need to check a couple settings here. So we'll find used with particle sprites, used with Niagara sprites, and then we can also, actually we'll just leave those two checked for now because we're just using sprites. But you could also come back if you're using meshes, you could do mesh particles, or if you're using ribbons, you could use that. But these should be good for us. Go ahead and scroll back up here. And the first thing we need to do is get a very important node, and that is the particle color node. And we'll just go ahead and plug RGB directly into emissive color. And what this does is it gets the particle color data that's set in the particle system itself, because you can get very specific with color and particle systems. For example, changing the color over the lifetime of the particle. For example, in the fire particle, you might want it to start at yellow, then fade to red, and then into black for the smoke. So this allows you to color the particle in the particle system instead of in the material. You can do it the opposite way where you do color it in here, but I think it's much more flexible to color it via the particle system itself. And also we'll be using the opacity, but we don't want to plug it right in. We actually want to multiply it. So I'll hold M and click for multiply, and then this will go into opacity. And then we need some more information down here, some more nodes. The first one is the depth fade node. This node is awesome. This allows you to basically fade translucent particles based on the intersecting meshes, for example, the floor or the character, so it doesn't look like a harsh line where the particle meets that mesh. I will go ahead and right click fade distance and promote that to a parameter. And then I want to set the default value to be 25. This is something that you'll want to change per instance if you want to adjust it. And then we want to go ahead and drag over to the left a little bit, and I'll right click and search for radial gradient exponential. And we want to right click on radius and convert to parameter, and right click on density and promote that to a parameter. The default value for both of these can be 0.5. And this essentially creates a spherical gradient on the sprite. So around the edges, it will be translucent, and then you'll be able to fade it in towards the center. Then we need another multiply, so I'll hold the M and click, plug this into the bottom, and then the output into opacity. And then we need the A. And this is going to be our texture. So I'll right click and search for texture, texture sample parameter 2D. I'll call this texture. And on the left here, I just want to scroll down and find the default texture parameter here and search for noise. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you should find this tiling noise 05. We'll just use that for the default. And then from the R channel, we want to drag off and search for subtract. And then I'll hold S and click for a scalar parameter, and I'll call this bias. This allows us to basically lower the white values in the texture to be closer to black in case we want the texture to not be as dense. This basically allows us to control and manipulate this texture more than how, or to make it look different from how it looks here. And then we'll also drag off of this and search for a power node. You can also use a multiply node here, but with the power node, it is a little bit more dynamic, and it gives you a little bit better results, in my opinion. However, multiply would work fine as well. I'll duplicate bias here, copy and paste, and then change the name to contrast. I'll set the default value on contrast to 0, and then I'll plug this into multiply. Lastly, we need to go to the left of the textures and just plug in some UVs. So I'll search for a multiply off of that. And then I'll right click and search for text or text chord or text coordinate. And then this will go into the A of the multiply. And then I'll hold S and click for another scalar. And I'll call this texture scale. I'll set the default value to be 0.5, so it's a little bit stretched out from the default. A higher value would mean that it tiles more frequently, you would see more detail, and we'll change that per instance anyway. Looks like we're good now to go ahead and save and go back to our content browser. And then once we're back here in the content browser, we can go ahead and right click on our material and create a material instance. And I'll call this mi underscore particle underscore poison. The first particle system will be the poison one. And now that we have that, we can go ahead and open it up and drag it on the screen here. And I'll just go ahead and check everything on how it is by default. And then we can actually leave this for now. And then after we create the particle system, we can adjust it so it looks a little bit better. So for now, I'll just save and close out of that. Next, we can right click in here and go to Niagara System. Now there's quite a lot of options here to start from, but the one that I like to start with that has the most effects built in already is the fountain. So I'll just click fountain and then I'll click create. I'll call this NS for Niagara System underscore poison. We can now double click to open that up. And as you can see, it looks nothing like poison yet, but with a few changes to this, we'll be able to get it working pretty great. The first thing that we want to do is click on the fountain node, and then we can go to particle spawn. And then we want to select skeletal mesh location. From here, we can go to the preview mesh, and I'll just go ahead and click that. And I'll type in skm underscore Manny simple. To see this working a little bit better, we can click on this fountain and then go to add velocity. And I'll just go ahead and clear the minimum and maximum. And as you can see, it's kind of starting to look like it's spawning from the silhouette of the mannequin, which is great. The next thing that we can do is just click back on the root node here. And every time you click on the root node, it basically shows you all of the different properties in one long big list. But if you click on one individual thing, like for example, shape location, it will just show you the shape location. But again, if I click on this again, the root node, it will show everything. We can scroll down a bit until we find spawn rate. I want to change this to 250. And then lifetime min, we'll do 1, and lifetime max, we can do 2. From here, we can scroll down and find the sprite size. So here we go, we have the sprite size. And I'll do 50 and 100. And next we can keep scrolling down until we find the velocity. And I actually don't want any velocity, so I'll just put this to be 0. And then we can keep scrolling down until we find the gravity. So gravity by default is set to negative 980. But I actually want these particles to go upward, like it's a poison gas. It's kind of, raising up into the air a bit. So I'll just set it to be 5, positive 5. And now you can see that they're very slightly going upwards after they spawn. Now we can go to the particle update here. And I actually want to click this little plus sign and search for scale sprite size. I'm going to add this module here. Now that we have this new module, we can see here on the left, it looks different. It's actually starting smaller and then growing to be bigger. What we need to do now on the right is set these to be different. So I'm going to set the number on the left here to be 1. And then I just want to select this key on the right, and I'll set it to be 1.25. So they're just going to slightly grow after they spawn. So this key on the left again is at 0 time, but 1 value, and then the one on the right is at 1 time and 1.2 value. You can select both of these by clicking and dragging, and then right-clicking on one of them. And then if you go down to auto, it will smoothly interpolate the line, which looks a little bit better, a little bit more natural. Next, we can go down and find scale color. And we can then just go ahead and click up here, and we want to do RGB linear or RGBA linear color curve. And now you can see that we have this top bar, which has 2 pins or 2 keys. For example, if I set this left one to be blue and this right one to be red, it will eventually, well, we need to actually set the material first. That's why this isn't working. So what we can do, go very down to the bottom here, click sprite render, and we can just click from this drop down and search for our poison material, our MI particle poison, and then go back to scale color. What I had to do for the color to come back in is actually just uncheck drag and then recheck it. But we don't want drag anyway, so I'll just turn that off. And now, as you can see, we have some color. If I drag this bar on the right closer, you'll see much faster it turns to be that other color. And if I change this first color, you can see that's the starting color. So now we have orange going into orange, but it could be orange going into blue. But we actually don't need 2 different colors for poison, so I'll just click on one of these and then delete, and then I'll double click on this first one and set it to be a very, very vibrant green. And then we have the opacity at the bottom here. That's what this is. So if I click on one of these, you'll see opacity 1, and this one will say opacity 0. I want to drag this first one into the middle a little bit more, and then I'll just double click on the left here under the white, and then we get a new key. So I'll just double click on this key now, and I'll set this one to be 0. So as you can see now, and you can see both here on the left and on the right, you can visualize this graph here. It's starting at 0 opacity, going up to 1 opacity, and then back down to 0. So now these particles are looking really smooth when they spawn and when they fade out. All right, now once we have the particle system built, we can go ahead and just click save, and I'll dock this up next to my level like that. And then what I want to do now is go to my character. So I'll go to content, third person, blueprints, and then BP third person character. And then inside of here, I want to select my mesh here, and then at the top left, click add, and then click on Niagara Particle System component, and it will add it directly as a child to the mesh. And then once we have Niagara selected, I'll just click on the right here on the Niagara system asset and search for my poison. And as you can see right away, it's starting to look like my character is covered in poison. So I'll just compile. And then if I dock this next to my level as well, I can go back. And then when I play, you can see we have this poison effect. Now you'll notice though, as I run, it does sort of drag behind, and There's probably some ways that you can make this speed up faster. One method that I like to do is to increase the spawn rate, but then lower the lifetime. It really just depends on your project and what kind of effect you're going for. But some things that you'll definitely want to play with in the particle system are the spawn rate. So I'm at 250, and then also the lifetime. So if you go to initialize particle, you'll see lifetime min and max. If I set this to be maybe 0.1 and 0.2 really fast, and then go to play, you'll see it's a very crazy effect. So it's just something to mess around with if you want to try some different looks. I'll put it at 1 and 2. Then we can go back to our level. What I'll do is drag in my third person character and rotate like this. And then I'll go to my content browser, Niagara, and find my particle material, and then drag this to the side. And the first thing we can do is set the bias to be negative 0.1. So you can see that brings out some more of the particles. And then we'll leave the contrast at 2. I'll set the density to be 0.75. And then the fade distance, that can stay at 25. And then the texture scale, I'll just increase a little bit to 0.6. And that's looking pretty cool. Now, if this effect is too intense for you, there's all sorts of things that you can do in the material to fix that. One is going to be the density. So you can just lower the density or increase it. You can see kind of how that affects it. I might do something like 0.45 or 0.4, and I'll leave it like that. I think that looks pretty great. Drag it to the side. So there's one more thing that we should do before we duplicate our particle system, and that is to add a way to remove some bones that the meshes or the particles are spawning on. So it's hard to tell now, but there's actually a bunch of particles spawning from the root of the character. So if I go back to my character, we can look at the, content, characters, mannequins, meshes, and we'll look at the skeleton. And I just want to show really quickly. So if I click on the center of mass, you can see that there's a bone here. So it's technically spawning particles from this bone as well as every other bone on the character. And there's also like the interaction bone, there's the IK hand root bone, and so forth. So we need to add a way in our particle system to ignore these bones. I'll close out of my skeleton and I'll go back to my particle system. And we just need to click on our skeletal mesh location. And then we need to go down to our bone sampling mode. So we have random all bones, but we need it to be random unfiltered bones. If I hover over the selection here, it says on unfiltered, it says choose from bones that are not defined by the filtered list. So we definitely don't want to have to type in every single bone that we want particles to spawn on. We want to just select some bones that we don't want them to spawn on. So we'll select the random unfiltered bones. And then as you can see, there's no change yet because we haven't selected any bones. And it'll be hard to tell anyway because of this particle, it's quite big. But if we go to filtered bones and we add to the array, it kind of jumps up a bit, which is annoying. But once it does that, you can go back and find filtered bones and then element number 0, none. So the first one that we want to select is root. And then we can add another one to the array. And then now we want to scroll pretty much all the way down until we find the IK foot root. And then we'll add another one. Click on none and then scroll all the way down again. And then IK hand root. Click it once more. Scroll all the way down and find the interaction. And then one more. And that will be the very last option, center of mass. So this takes care of all of those bones that happen at the very bottom center of the character between the feet, which it's really hard to tell with this sort of particle system, but it will be obvious when you have smaller particles that are spawning faster and more full looking. So this will just keep them off of that. Now we can go ahead and save, go back to our content browser in our Niagara folder. And now we're good to duplicate this particle system because we don't want to have to do that bone thing again. Unfortunately, Niagara systems aren't super scalable. You can't create an instance of this. So we'll just have to right click and duplicate. I'll call this ns underscore lightning. we can go ahead and open up Lightning and drag that onto the screen. I'll just dock it up next to Poison for now and go back to my content browser. And I'll go ahead and right click on my particle Poison and I'll duplicate it and I'll call it MI particle lightning. Once we have that, we can open it up. And the first thing that we can do is set the bias back to 0. We'll set the contrast to be 20. The density can be 5. The fade distance, that can actually be lowered to about 10. Radius can be 0.1. Texture scale 1.5. And then we want to change the texture to a texture called laser. It should be in your projects. It comes with the engine. Now that we have that, and as you can see, we have this sort of streak line here. If I double click to open up this texture, you can see kind of what's going on here. So this is the basic effect that we'll be seeing in our particle. But of course, we'll be able to color it and add some other changes to it. So now that we have that, we can go back to our lightning particle system. And I'll very firstly go down to our sprite render and then change the material to be the lightning material that we just made. And you can see that it's on there, and that looks kind of cool as it is, but that's obviously not the effect that we're going for. So we do need to make some changes. The first thing that we can do is to uncheck scale sprite size. You could also right click and delete this, but I'll leave it there in case maybe later I want to come back and edit it. Maybe I want this lightning streaks to grow or shrink over time. The next thing that I want to do is just to click on the root node again and then go to spawn rate. And I'll just set it to be 50, so quite a bit lower. And then I'll scroll down to lifetime. And our lifetime min and max, I'll just set random and I'll click where it says random and I'll set it to be direct set. And I'll type in 0.075. Now you can start to see a little bit the lightning flashing in and out very fast. And then we can scroll down a bit, and I just want to increase the min and max both by 50. So the min will become 100 and the max will become 150. Next, we can go to on the left, we can select scale color. And then I'll just select this first knob here, double click it, and then I'll set the value to be 1,000. So now we're starting to get that bloom sort of lightning effect where it's glowing. And then we can just go ahead and save, go back to our level, and I'll just duplicate my character here. And then I'll, in the details panel, scroll down in this little middle section and click on the Niagara. And then from NS Poison, I'll click and I'll search for NS_lightning. And as you can see, we have this really cool lightning effect. And I think it looks pretty great. You can always go back to the lightning particles system and double click on the color and set it to be even brighter. What if I do 5,000? Looks pretty awesome. What if I go nighttime? Yeah, that's looking pretty cool. But seeing the poison at nighttime reminds me that that could probably be toned down a bit. But you can always mess around with the material parameters and the color on that one if you please. And now we can go ahead and duplicate the poison material once more. So I'll duplicate poison, not lightning, because I want to use poison as the starting point for the fire. So I'll do NS_fire. And then I'll also duplicate my poison material. And I'll call it particle_fire. And then we can double click to open up NS fire. And then the first thing that I want to do is go down to sprite render and then search for my fire. Should be able to just scroll up and you'll see it. Shouldn't see any change yet because we haven't changed any of the colors or logic. And this time I actually want to adjust the material first. So that way, while we're editing the particle system features, we'll see it look a little bit better in the preview. So I'll just double click on my MI particle fire. And then the first thing that I want to do is set the bias to be -0.45. And then the contrast can be 10. The density will be 0.75. The fade distance can stay at 25. The radius can be 0.5 and the texture scale can be 0.25. Now if we go ahead and save and go back to our fire. There we go. That's looking a little bit more interesting. And then now we can go ahead and start messing with some settings on our particle system. The first thing that we want to do is go to our spawn rate, and I'll set this to be 200. And then I'll scroll down, find lifetime, and then lifetime I'll set to be 3 as the minimum and 4 as the maximum. These can be changed slightly if you like. You can try maybe 2 or 1, but I'll leave it at 3. And then I'll scroll down to find the sprite size, and then the minimum will be 150 and the maximum 200. And then from here, we want to find the particle state, or sorry, scale sprite size. And then we'll start at 1, and then we'll go up to 2. And then I also want to add a new module, so I'll click on particle update, and then I'll search for rotation. And I want to find the sprite rotation rate module. This allows the particle to rotate over time. So you could just set a single value here, like 100, and then they'll all rotate in the positive direction at 100 units. But what we want to do is on the far right, click this little down arrow, and then we'll change it to random range float. Then I'll set it to be -25 and +25. So now they'll all randomly go between -25 and 25 rotation rate. It just makes it look a little bit more interesting. The next thing that we can do is go to scale color, and this is where we're going to do a little bit more than we had done with the poison. So the first thing is we'll add a couple more points here. So I have one at the far right and then 2 kind of in the middle here. And I will drag this opacity to the side a little bit and add another one. And then this one here I'll set to be 1. So it'll just be more solid for longer. And then we can go ahead and click on this first point here. And I'll set it to be a yellowish orange color. And then the next one I'll set to be more of a red. And then this third one, I'll lower the saturation all the way and then make it a very dark gray. And then the final one, I will bring all the way down to black. And it looks pretty good, but the reason that it looks sort of too bright or a little bit too transparent is because of our material instance. So if I go back to my MI particle fire, remember I was mentioning earlier about the blend mode being additive or transparent, or sorry, translucent. If we change it from additive to translucent, and then we go back to NS fire, you'll see now it's much more vibrant and you can see the colors more like the black coming in there. What I might do actually is bring the red closer in as well as the blacks. Now we can go ahead and compile and save. I think that's all, but let's go ahead and see how it looks on our character, and then we can always adjust it later. So I'll go back to my level and I'll duplicate my character once more. And then again, in the details here in the center, find Niagara, and then NS lightning, I want to find my NS underscore fire. It's looking pretty good, but there's a couple things that we need to do to make it look even better. So I'll go back to my Niagara system, and I want to find gravity force. And I want to set the Z here, the last number, to be 25. So now the fire is sort of going upwards much, much faster instead of just hanging around the character. One more thing that I want to change on this particle system on the fire is I want the particles to start off much smaller. So I'll go back to my particle system and I'll find the scale sprite size. If I zoom out, you can see this full graph. And this first pin here, the first key, I want it to be 0.4. Let's try that. So now the fire should start smaller and then grow bigger over time. And I think that that looks much better actually how it is. And of course you can play with the different times and sizes and colors and all that to get really any result that you can imagine. And one very last thing that I want to show is how to add a secondary emitter in the same particle system. So let's add some embers to this fire particle system. Let me just go back to my NS fire. And then the first thing that I want to do is just to copy and paste this entire node here. And as of right now, basically it's doubling up the particle system. If I go back, you'll see it's even more intense, which actually looks quite cool, but that's a lot of particle spawning, and we want to use that instead to spawn embers. So the first thing that we can do is go to the spawn rate, and I'll set it to be lower, like something about 50. And then lifetime, I'll just lower that a bit by 1 on each of these. So instead of, we'll do 2 and 3 instead of 3 and 4. And then the size, I'll set the minimum to 0.25 and then the maximum to be 0.5 or maybe 0.75. And that's good for the base settings. Now we can go down to the gravity force, and I just want to double this. So instead of 25, we'll do 50. And then now we can go to scale color, and I'm going to delete the far top right 3 nodes. We just want the top left one here. It's just for the single color, and I'll double click that. And I want to set the value here to be much higher, something like 2000. And right away, now you can see we have some embers spawning, looking pretty cool. I think that's it. Let's go back to our system. It's a little bit too uniform though. So what we can do is go back to our Niagara, and then we can go to add velocity, and we'll set the velocity to be, 25 for the minimum and 25 for the max. And we'll change it from in cone to from point. And now you can see that the particles for the embers are sort of randomly swaying around, because when they're initially spawned, they have a random, or actually not random, they all have 25. We could do 25 for the minimum and then maximum 50. Let's see how that looks. That looks pretty awesome. What I might do is go back to the system and set the minimum to be 0. So that way some will just go straight up, and then some will have a maximum of 50. This should tone down the effect a bit, but it'll still look pretty awesome. Yeah, so you could use this same logic to layer things on top of the lightning effect if you wanted, on top of the poison. You can really create some complex stuff just by duplicating and changing the scales and the intensities of the colors and things like that. You can even have a separate material for the embers. For example, here I used the same material from the fire. However, I just scaled it down and increased the color exponentially, and that ended up looking quite nice. Alrighty guys, that's going to do it for this tutorial on spawning Niagara Particle Systems on your skeletal mesh characters. If you learned anything new at all, it'd mean a lot if you left a like on the video and subscribe to our channel. And just as a friendly reminder, if you did struggle to follow along, the files will be available on my Patreon, which is currently 50% off until November. This has been Vylocity with Pitchfork Academy, and I'll see you in the next one.